This is Jerry Barrett talking. Today's date is March 19th, 1986. I'm interviewing Jerry Losness. I'll spell that, L-O-S-N-E-S-S, in his office at Eastern Airline headquarters in Miami. Jerry, why don't you start by just talking a little bit about what your prior experience before your current job?
Okay. Well, I'm from Wisconsin, and I went to school at the University of Wisconsin at Eau Claire for an undergraduate in accounting, and then to the University of Wisconsin in Madison, where I got my MBA in finance. And then I graduated in 1968, and I started working with Eastern at that point in time. I graduated in June, started here in July of 1968. Started in the finance department as a financial analyst, worked my way up in both financial analysis and financial planning, and then I became a division controller, spent some time there, and then as a director of financial planning and control in the flight operations division. And then in 1984, I went to work for Colonel Borman as his assistant, and that was about August of 1984. And I worked for him until about October of 1985, and then I became the Vice President of Financial Planning and Control, and moved into this position at that time.
Okay.
So that's a quick synopsis of my 17, almost 18 years at Eastern in a few minutes.
Okay. Okay, good. Very good. How did that come about, working for Borman? How did you happen to do that?
Well, I think it was, he had an individual that was working for him, Dick Fisher, and Dick was getting ready for retirement. And so Frank was looking for somebody to replace Dick. And I had gotten exposure to Frank over the years through contract negotiations. I got involved a lot in the pilot negotiations. I got to know Frank then, and he got to know me and my personality. And I guess he was looking around in the corporation for who was the type of person he wanted in that position. And I don't know how many people he looked at, but anyway, he got in touch with me and wanted to know if I would be interested. And so I viewed it as a golden opportunity to get some very good experience and exposure at the senior level management.
Oh, yes.
Plus just the opportunity of working for Frank, and what you could learn from that was challenging enough.
Yeah.
So that's...
What did you do for him? What was that job like?
I guess it was, I would have to say it's very unstructured and undefined. It was, I viewed it more or less as trying to take care of all those matters that came to his office that really didn't require his time, so that it could free up his time to spend on more important things. Mm-hmm. And this may be, a piece of it would be going through and reviewing the mail and trying to sort out some of the more important things and highlighting some of those so that he could focus his attention in on the specifics, looking at some of the daily operating stuff, finding areas where I could see maybe some problems developing and try and bring those to his attention, preparing presentations for him for securities analysts or to some other financial type presentations that he was going to make to people in the industry, and I guess other administrative type functions if he had something he needed done, maybe a little project that he wanted somebody to do, but he didn't want to send out through the normal staff procedures to take care of that. Mm-hmm. Just a combination of things that were required to keep the office of the chairman and the president running as efficiently and as smoothly as possible.
Did you find it as interesting as you thought you would?
Yeah, I would say that it was probably even more so. Again, because when I first was contacted as to whether I would be interested in working there, I wanted to make sure that it wasn't just strictly an administrative type function where you really didn't get much exposure to the airline and exposure to what was going on. And I was assured that that was the way it was going to be, and in fact it was as much what I wanted to make of it, the job. So I had all the latitude that I needed, and so from that standpoint I got exposure to a lot of people in a lot of areas, and learned a lot about the company that you just don't see working out on a divisional level or in a lower level. Plus, I would say, from a personal standpoint, the exposure to the different management styles of the senior executives in a major corporation, as well as to Colonel Borman himself, I think was invaluable in itself. And because of the time, what was going on at Eastern at that time, and the exposure to what was going on, it was very interesting. I would also have to say it was probably more frustrating from the standpoint that you got exposed to a lot of the problems that the corporation was facing, whereas those people out in the divisional level or at the stations weren't even aware that we were facing the types of crises that we were facing. So as a result, you'd get wrapped up in the exposure to these crises, and you would worry about it and be concerned about it and try and think of ways that you could make some recommendation to Colonel Borman or other people that we could address the problems. So, from that standpoint, there's a lot more frustrations than you would normally have. But it was enjoyable.
The more you broaden, the more problems you see.
Yes.
And that's part of the frustration.
Yeah, and the more you get to the top and see just what some of the problems that the corporation is facing, that Frank was facing at the time, some of the things he was going through, on the labor front, and the things that would come up and probably be resolved without very many people really knowing that there was a problem to begin with. It was very interesting.
During some of that time, no, you probably met Bill Esser before that, huh?
No, I had not. I really didn't know Bill until I started working for Frank. I think I knew who he was, but I wasn't involved in any of the labor relations immediately preceding that. When I was involved in contract negotiations with the pilots, covered probably from 71 or 2 through 81, somewhere in there.
Oh, okay.
And I think Bill came on the scene after that. I think he came on probably around 82 or 83 when we were starting having the major problems with the IAM. So I really wasn't involved that much in labor relations once Bill came on the scene. But then, once I got up there, then I spent quite a bit of time with Bill and really got to know him, as an individual as well as, professionally at work. And it was a very enjoyable experience.
Yeah, the role he played was unique in the sense of, although he's on the corporation's, not their payroll, but he's a consultant to them. It's kind of an unusual attachment he has because of his also this rapport that he has with the unions.
Yes, I think it was. I'm sure it was a very challenging type assignment for Bill, in that he had a reputation as a mediator, working both with labor and with management, and trying to resolve conflicts and bring the two parties together in a compromising type approach until they could come to an agreement. But then the more he was retained as a consultant by the company, I think the more labor would tend to view him as being a management employee and more management oriented, and that made it that much more challenging for Bill to still function as a mediator and try and bring the two sides together and keep sort of an aura of independence around him. And I think I think Bill did very good at that. I think it made it difficult for him because he had a lot more exposure to the management side of it and what management was seeing. And I think it's like anything, if you can see the problems and what's developing and why one side has taken the position they're taking, you can relate to that position and understand it, because it's usually not a manufactured position. There are some very strong and definite facts that support it. So Bill would see that, and he could see why management was doing what they were doing, and he could lean towards saying, well, yeah, that's really what needs to be done, but yet he would have to back off and say, okay, that may be fine, but if we want to get an agreement, we're going to have to view it from labor side as well, and what is acceptable to labor, and not just what management may need,
Mhm.
but how do I put this all together? And I know from talking with Bill over the weeks and months when this was going on, that he would spend many a sleepless night or wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning and trying to sort out in his mind, okay, I've talked to Charlie Bryans and the Larry Schultes and the Bob Callahans. I understand their viewpoint. I've talked to Frank Borman and Senior Management Eastern. I understand their viewpoint. And they both seem to be pretty well locked in concrete. How do I get the two sides to move and come together so that we can some way reach an agreement and get through the problems that we have? So I'm sure that he had a very difficult time, very challenging time. But again, he's very professional. He's been at it for a long time, and he knows how the whole process works. And even though he got frustrated, I think he rose above it, did a good job.
Can you talk a little bit about the experience with the pilots? That was a sort of over as much as a 10-year period. You had something. Can you describe what that was?
Okay, my involvement from labor relations and negotiations got involved as I was the finance representative on the negotiating committee for the company. And I first got involved, I think it was around 71 or 72, I forget the exact time, as the finance representative. And the pilot contract is, as I came to learn, as I understand now, is probably one of the most, if not the most complicated labor agreements that there is. And maybe not just Easterns, but in the airline industry, a pilot contract is more difficult to understand for an outsider than any other agreement.
Mm-hmm.
Because of the intricacies that either been built in to protect one side or the other for whatever reason, I'm not sure. So when I first got involved, there was a huge learning process of just learning, I guess, some of the buzzwords that were used when they were getting into negotiations. And the people that live with us every day, they would refer to a section of the contract by a number, like section 13 or whatever. Well, right away, or they might even refer to a paragraph in there as 13A, B, A, or something.
Yeah.
Okay, and coming in, you didn't even know what they were talking about.
Yes.
So initially, you just had to go in and try and pick that up, and it's not the type of document that you can sit down and read. You read it 2 or 3 times and make sense out of it, because there's interpretations and everything else that you have to live with. So that was, I guess, the initial part was just picking that up. But then going through the years, seeing the different negotiating committees and getting associated with them on both sides, on both the company side and the pilot side, that just the different personalities that got involved in labor relations and in negotiations, and the different way that the different negotiations would take place,
Mm-hmm.
and depending on the personalities on each side, as to whether there might be a more of a cooperative type atmosphere, or there might be an atmosphere where one side or the other may get really dug in on a position and they were just not going to move. And I think also it would vary depending on the situation at the time. One of the negotiations, the Wage and Price Board was in existence,
Right.
that President Nixon had imposed. And so therefore, there's very little movement from a compensation standpoint because you were locked in.
Mm-hmm.
So that negotiation went very quickly because there wasn't a lot of issues. There was another negotiation that I think we were going at it for much over a year in trying to resolve the negotiations, and it was just because of the personalities and I guess the strengths or weaknesses of each side would dictate how long it's going to take and who was going to come out with a better contract
Mm-hmm.
of the two. And I guess the one thing that, I guess the impression I have from all this is that there's really you can't have a winner and a loser in contract negotiations, because there may be a winner or loser in one round, but when you go back to negotiate again the next round, the other side is going to remember the one that was a loser, and they're going to come back and make sure they gain more than they lost.
Yeah.
So to the extent you can keep a balance there, I think you're better off in the long run.
Yeah, it's a continuing relationship. So that,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it was very interesting, and very enjoyable. And I also I got involved in the flight attendant negotiations a couple times. One of them when we had a strike deadline, and went right down to the deadline with the flight attendants. And in fact, I think they went on strike for about 6 hours before we reached an agreement with them. But that was, I guess, a different involvement from my part, was that I was more just the financial consultant type on there, where I would do all the price outs of the different proposals and determine what it was going to cost the company.
Oh, yeah.
But with the pilots, the more time I was involved in each negotiation, I would get more and more involved in the discussions of, the strategy we wanted to follow and those types of things.
How big a team does management usually use with the pilots?
Usually they have 2 pilots who are ALPA members but who are working in management positions.
Oh, okay.
So they're flight management types. And then there's an individual who is usually knowledgeable in the crew scheduling area, in that part of the contract. They usually have a financial representative and a lawyer. So it's, let's see, 2, 3, 4, probably 5 or 6 is usually the normal makeup of it.
I understand before Al Gibson got involved, the spokesman was always a pilot.
Yes. Well, no, I'm not sure that's true. I think, because this goes way back, probably in the 60s sometimes, there was a gentleman named Bill Watley who was in labor relations, and he got involved in pilot negotiations.
Huh.
And that was way before my time. But the impression I have from the discussions was that I think he was the spokesman, so back maybe in the early 60s.
Right.
Okay, but there were always pilot members on there.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Okay, and then since sometime in the mid or late 60s, the spokesman was always a pilot, up until I guess it was probably in around 80 or 81. I think that's when it was, when Al became the director of labor relations and flight operations. And at that time, then he assumed the responsibility of being the chief negotiator.
Mm-hmm. The pilots as a group have reasonably good formal educations. Does that make it easier to do some of the number to get them to understand some of the number calculations that you had to do?
Yeah, I think it makes it easier to work with them as a group. But again, I guess it was as much a personality type thing as an education as to what the groups were like to deal with. But they would normally have somebody on their committee that they would consider as their financial person, consultant, advisor,
Right.
responsible for the financial pieces of it. And it would usually vary, but it was probably somebody that, now I know they have a lot of people that have MBAs in finance who are pilots. And these may be people that either had a bachelor's degree in finance, or they just had a strong interest. Hold on.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, getting back, I forget exactly where I left off, but we're talking about the financial representative, that they have people now with MBAs in finance or bachelor's in, even, going back in the, I guess in the early 70s and through the 70s, again, it would depend on the individual.
Mhm.
Some of the people that were the financial people for the pilots were very sharp, did a very good job. In other ones, they had to spend more time with trying to explain to them, how things had to be priced out and how things worked and what the value was of the various proposals.
Mhm.
So, it varied back and forth.
But if you could, if a proposal's made and you cost it out, and you could convince the pilot's financial expert, that would be a deal then. It wouldn't be a matter of having to convince the whole committee as much as it would.
No, not necessarily. Usually what would happen is we'd get into negotiations, and they would have certain things they wanted, and we'd have certain things we wanted. And they were aware that usually before the negotiations would start, the negotiating committee would go into senior management and make a request for an allotment or of a certain amount of money that can be spent on the contract.
Okay.
In a presentation we made to senior management saying, okay, here's what we think has to be done. Here's the kind of pay proposals we think we're going to have to make. Here's the kind of work rule changes we think we're going to have to make, and any other economic items as well as non-economic. And so here's what we think it's going to take to get a contract, and that's going to cost us so much a year for the 2.5 or 3 years that we're proposing the contract for. And then senior management would either sign off on it or say, no, we're not going to spend that money or whatever. So that would more or less give us an authorization of how much we could spend.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and the pilots would be aware of that. And so we would, normally we would not tell them how much that authorization was. Right. But we'd go through that and price out the different pieces, and they were always trying to find out what it was. And so we'd go through and price out the different pieces. And you know, they may agree on some of the price outs, and they may not agree on some others, because for some of them they would have to take our word on it, because on some of the work rule changes we would run them through our computers, and we could determine what the impact would be on manpower and how many heads we'd have to add to make some of these changes, or how many we could save if we made the changes. They would not have that capability. Mm-hmm. So therefore they would just have to accept that. And I think some of them were knowledgeable enough about how our computers worked and the programs that they understood what was behind the numbers, and so they would be more apt to accept the numbers than maybe some of the other ones were. Mm-hmm. But then again, there'd be times when they didn't care what the numbers said.
Oh,
they had taken a position, that was it, and you know, I don't care what the numbers are. Okay. This is the way it's going to be, or no, we're not going to do that.
Okay. The facts aside, sort of argument. Huh? Yeah.
That's right. Okay. So I guess it was just one big gray area as far as negotiations were concerned.
What was the basis of the submission you would make, or the presentation you'd make to top management? Would you do some? Would you personally do some research on that to see what the competition was doing?
Yeah, we there's a group called the it's AIRCON, or Airline Industrial Relations Conference. Okay. That most of the airlines anyway belong to, and as each airline would reach an agreement, they would submit that to AIRCON. AIRCON would then summarize it, and they would then make that information available to all the other airlines. Mm. So therefore, we could keep track every time another airline would settle, for example, as to how much they were paying their pilots. Okay, and then, so a lot of what we would do is we'd develop some charts or graphs that would show what the pay was, and usually we'd take say a captain that's flying 80 hours, half day, half night pay, a 12-year longevity, to make it on a comparable basis for all the airlines. Mm. Sometimes we'd use 75 hours because of the airline contracts would be enough, there'd be enough difference that we'd look at 75 hours for one airline is comparable to 80 hours at another airline because of some of the work rule in credit rigs they had in place. So then, and we would try to put them on a comparable basis, and we'd see that, okay, maybe Delta was paying their pilots $5,000 a month over this time period, and then it's going to jump up to $5,200, and another airline was paying $4,800, and then they're going to go to $5,000, and then to $53,000, and so we'd chart all this out and take a look at it and say, okay, now where do we feel that we have to be competitive with what's in the industry? And the unions would do the same thing. And what they would look at is whatever the last contract was settled, that was the minimum they were going to accept, and they were going to go up from there. So then they would establish a new base, then another airline would come along, and they'd have a base just higher and higher and higher. So it was that constant battle. So it wasn't that we had any more, any better information than they did, just that we would use it differently and view it differently. So we would take a look at this, knowing what the pilots, how they were viewing it, and saying, okay, we think we're going to have to at least equal Delta from a pay standpoint. So therefore, that's going to be more or less the type of money we're going to have to put on the table for pay. And then we'd look at some work rule changes, and then we'd try and identify some ways where we could either get some expense savings or some productivity improvements or whatever to try and offset some of the dollar cost in the salary area. and I guess the other area that made it more challenging with the pilots was because of the benefits, primarily the pension. They have a lot better pension than anybody else at Eastern.
Oh.
And so, and this is something they negotiated over the years. They negotiated in such a way that they put more money into their pension than they did into their salaries. Because once they got their salaries up to a certain level, then with taxes and everything else, and it's just becoming discretionary income at a very high tax rate, they would rather take that same amount of money and put it into their pension fund, so that would give them more money when they came to retirement purposes. So that was the other piece of it that we'd have to look at, is what was happening as far as retirement for the other airlines that we were competing with. And there was enough difference in the way the pension plans were put together that it wasn't always apples and apples.
Oh, okay.
And so you'd have to make some interpretations and then determine what the cost impact was going to be. And it just made it that much more challenging and that much more fun.
When in the mid-'60s, when they began talking a little bit about the possibility of deregulation, did you get involved in studies to see how that would impact, or did Eastern do much anticipation of that in terms of calculating the financial impact?
I think you said the mid-'60s. It was the mid-'70s.
I'm sorry, yes.
Clarify that.
Yes.
I don't know. No, I don't recall getting involved in a lot of studies and what ifs, because I'm not sure if anybody really knew what was going to be the impact of deregulation. Now, I know Frank indicated even when the push was on for deregulation, that the people that were going to suffer from deregulation was going to be labor. And I think he'd indicated that from back in the mid-'70s when it was first being proposed, and there's a strong push for it, that in the long run labor was going to be the group or the ones that are going to suffer the most from deregulation. And I think the facts have proven that out. Because and I guess, if you really stop and think about it, which I'm sure he did, and that's why he came up with it, is it says, okay, once you're deregulated and somebody can come in and start operating an airline, they're going to have to pay the same amount of money to buy an airplane. They're going to have to pay the same amount of money to buy fuel for an airplane. They're going to have to pay the same amount of money to land an airplane at an airport, or to rent space, or to put food on. An option they would have is not putting food on, but if they put food on, it's going to be the same cost. But the only thing that they wouldn't have to pay the same amount of money for is labor, because they would be starting out, they would not have a union, and they could go out and hire people at whatever the market rates were to bring people on. And that was obviously what happened with People's Express and the other new entrants that came in, and what gives them the big advantage today. And what really, I guess, brought us to the problems we had at Eastern and made us go through the major crises is that without making the adjustments to labor, we were no longer competitive, and so we had to do something.
Can you talk a little bit about the, really for the layman, the difference between different people I've talked to today in terms of just title, or in the last couple of days? What's the difference between finance, the controller, and the treasurer, in terms of the running of the business? I mean, I'm just looking for kind of a thumbnail.
Okay. Well, the treasurer gets more involved with the cash management and the financing of airplanes, or financing anything that we're buying, in the dealing with the bankers in the financial community as far as borrowing money. So it's more, I guess, the external focus of financing the airline with the outside community.
Okay.
The controller's function is involved with the budgeting aspect and monitoring the expenses that we're paying on a monthly or continuous basis, and making sure that, or I guess trying to make sure that we are not spending any more than we have to for the services that we're buying, or the materials that we're buying, or whatever the cost is to run an airline. to make it as efficient as possible.
And then,
So I see that's a two basic, that's a basic difference between the two.
and then where does finance fall?
Finance includes both of them. Finance is a broader group that includes treasury, it includes a controller, and it includes accounting, the accounting function, which is the recording of all the revenues and expenses on a continuous basis, and all the different subsets that go along with that.
Okay.
So I would say there are probably three separate areas, main separate areas in finance, and the fourth one would be the auditing function.
Which is looking at what has happened.
Yeah, and just making sure that all the controls and all the procedures are such that we do have the controls over the various areas. I guess to protect the corporation, and that there isn't the opportunity, or trying to at least limit the opportunity for any theft, those types of things.
Did deregulation have were you surprised at the impact it's had?
Yeah, I'd have to say that I am. And maybe that's because I'm not as much of a forward thinker as a Frank Borman is, or somebody like that. But as far as the significant impact that it's had on the industry, yeah, I'd have to say that I am. I really didn't realize that there were going to be airlines like the People's Expresses, and the things were going to happen with Continental, and that was going to become such a driving force in the industry. I guess everybody was accustomed to the large airlines dominating the industry, and they still dominate it. But and that's probably true even of all the airlines, or there would not be the People's Express and the Continental today, because the Americans, Uniteds, Easterns, and Deltas would not have let them get off the ground. When People's Express started, they were very small, and they started on the fringes, and so the Easterns and Deltas were not going to sacrifice a lot of revenue by lowering their fares and charging the same fare as People's Express, and taking their competitive advantage away from them, because they felt it was going to cost too much money and sacrifice too much revenue. Using hindsight, I'm not sure if that would be the same case if people had known what was going to happen. And the same thing with Continental, when they filed bankruptcy and came out of bankruptcy. I think the airline industry gave them a price advantage when they came back and let them charge a lower fare, and as a result, it allowed them to come back and to generate enough revenue so that they could build and expand to where they are today. I think if the airlines would have gone in and matched their prices right at that point in time, that Continental would have run out of cash, and things may be different today. Now, and I'm not sure that would have prohibited what's happening today, but it may have delayed it, because you can take a Braniff. Braniff also went bankrupt, and it's taken them a lot longer, but they've come back. Now, nowhere near the size that Continental is, but who knows, they may get there someday.
It's an interesting change in a business that was relatively stable in terms of.
Yes, yeah, and I think one of the big things is, that I've always believed is, it's been a very difficult transition for the people that have worked in the airline industry while it was regulated, and then while it's deregulated, to completely change their thought process over to a deregulated environment. And I'm sure there are certain disciplines in the business that it's more important they do make that change. The marketing types, the planning types, that they have to make that change and realize there is a dramatic difference in the airline industry today. An accountant, the way he's doing his accounting, it probably doesn't make much difference whether it's regulated or deregulated, other than the governmental impact on it and what forms you have to fill out. But otherwise, it's probably not as significant there, just from a strictly accounting standpoint. Now, from a a controller standpoint, it is, because I think cost control has become a lot more critical in a deregulated environment, because you can no longer just automatically pass a cost through to the customer. You have to be competitive, and if you don't get your costs down, you're not going to be competitive.
And then certainly from a labor relations point of view, it's had, well, that's, you quoted Borman to the effect that that's where it was really going to impact
Yes.
on the unions.
Yeah, and I think that's the, I guess, the critical thing with the airline industry today, in my opinion, is whether labor is going to acknowledge the fundamental change in the airline industry. And I think it's even expanding beyond that into the total U.S. economy, is that it's not just the airlines that's been deregulated, it's happening to trucking, banking, and it's just, there are a lot of changes like that going on out in the economy, and that it's going to be important for labor to become aware of this and change accordingly. And I think if they're willing to change, they can probably maintain the strength that they have. To the extent they're not willing to change, then they'll probably get pushed aside. And just because of the marketplace, and not because anybody is either pro or anti-labor. It's just going to be more, I think, dictated by the marketplace as to what's going to happen out there. And it's like anything else. If there's going to be change, you can either participate or it's going to pass you by, but it's going to happen.
Yes, yeah. You can't stand in front of it, really.
No, that's right.
Not for long, anyway. Can you talk a little bit about the whatever role you had in the negotiations or deliberations in the during that '84 period when you were working closely with Frank Borman?
Okay.
You actually said mid '84,
yeah,
through the fall of '85.
Yes. Yes.
Well,
so
a number of things happened during that period. That
yeah, that was, it was after we had the crisis in '83. Okay, and we got through that, and then I went up there in August, and I guess the crisis we were starting to face at that time was we had the wage freeze in for 1984, and I had not gotten involved, and so I was not that familiar with what was or was not agreed to. But the impression I had then, once I got upstairs and from talking with Frank and hearing him talk and other people talk, is that labor had committed to getting back with management and fixing a problem if it still existed when we got to the end of 1984. And so it became one of these like a creeping delay type of a problem, where you know there's a problem there and you think you've got a fix for it, and so you don't do anything else, and then that time passes by and that doesn't fix it. Then you think you've got another one, and then another one, and the time just keeps passing until you come up to a crisis point. And I think that's what happened with the labor relations at that time, was that management felt that the unions had made a commitment that they were going to come in and sit down with management and resolve the problems before the end of 1984. And so I guess there were some discussions going on, and again, I'm not that familiar with what those discussions were between human resources and labor, or some of the other labor relations people in labor, and between Frank and Charlie Bryan and those types. But that they were constantly working and feeling that that labor had made a commitment and that they were going to come through. But we got into September and into October, and the unions had not come in, and we had not had these discussions, and we were looking at coming up to December 31st, and as to whether we were going to have to restore everybody's wages back to the salary of record, or what was going to happen on December 31st. And I think most of the employees were sitting out there expecting their wages to be restored on January 1st, and a company looking at the numbers and said, there's no way we can afford to do it, we just don't have the money. And so trying to get to labor and work with them, and we got into October and into November, and still not getting anything resolved, and into December. And so finally then the company was forced to put something out to the employees to tell them that they were not going to get their wages restored on January 1st. And so then that really created a lot of morale problems with all of the employees, and management was accused of going back on their commitment of restoring wages on January 1st, and management was position was that labor had committed that they would get back with the company in the summer or fall of 1984, see what 1885 was going to look like, and see what needed to be done to fix the problem. So there was those types of problems, and therefore there was a lot of credibility lost. Now whether it should or should not have been, is a matter of opinion, but it was lost because the rank and file was expecting to get their money back, and they didn't get it back, and then got into the negotiations with the unions, and then that's when we got into deciding, well, they were more or less up against a stone wall in negotiations and couldn't get either side to move, and that's, I think, when Bill Usry was really getting very active in the labor relations front, and he was trying to bring the two sides together and talking to both sides and finding out what their positions were and what they would or would not do. And he then came up with a proposal, and I forget how many points were in the proposal. And again, there's documentation on this. It can be dug out and filled in the facts on it. I'll give you my recollections of it. Is, if certain points were met, then labor would get together with management and get on with the negotiations.
Mm-hmm.
And one of those points was that all the wages would be restored for the month of January. And there were court cases going on at this time, and so it was more or less management and labor was forming their positions, and the more things that were happening, the more entrenched each side was becoming in their positions, because they were afraid, because of other factors such as the lawsuits, if they did something counter to that lawsuit, then it would weaken their position in the lawsuit, and they couldn't afford to lose it. So therefore they weren't sure they could afford to do something to get labor relations off from dead center, because it may cost them over here from a legal standpoint. So it was trying to work out all of those problems and get some kind of a balance there that would allow us to get on with labor relations and still not jeopardize either side's position in the lawsuit. And I think that's also where Usry played a big role, as well as Frank did too, in determining what was going to be done there. And so he came up with this proposal, and the company agreed to it and restored the wages for January, so that we could get back to negotiations. And I guess that in effect postponed the crisis date then till January 31st. And then that went up through the negotiations, and eventually resolved the issues. But I'm just thinking about some of the specifics that happened in this time frame. And I presume you want to get into some of that as well.
I'll tell you what, though, we're almost at the end,
Okay.
and I said I'd take 45 minutes, so
Okay,
let's
that's
close.
fine. We can come back to it
I promise
again.
we'll come back. Yeah,
Sure.
Okay.